Sometimes I wonder whether an apple a day really keeps the doctor away. A long lived proverb that advises children to take in a more diverse diet. But how much does a diverse diet actually affect your health? How much do other components of a healthy lifestyle actually matter? For a long time, I have been interested in what aspects of life can make me healthy. Is it adequate exercise? Maybe it's having a solid social life. Or it could be a combination of many things. As I grew more curious about health and lifestyle, I stumbled upon a simple chart from Our World in Data that outlined a completely complex topic. And, after reading it, I grew more and more fascinated with the concept of life expectancy. If you search up life expectancy and go to the Our World in Data website and you zoom in on the maps, we can see from 1950 that the US is one of the top countries with the highest life expectancies. And then we flash forward to 2015, and suddenly, many other countries rose far ahead of the US. If we take a look at Japan, they rose by an outstanding 23 years. So the question I'm extremely curious about is what is causing this? What do Japanese people do that places them in one of the world's highest life expectancies? In this podcast series, I will outline 4 major components to longevity: history, diet and nutrition, genetics, and lifestyle. The US had just dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki. In total, roughly 120,000 Japanese people were killed. Many of the nation's plants and factories were obliterated to dust. Thousands of houses were decimated, and countless families have split apart. Japan found itself in ruins. Yet despite the country being in tatters, they looked at their situation in a different light. As many other countries still had outdated plants and machinery from 1865, Japan was able to start anew with modern technology. The first years in the aftermath were devoted to rebuilding the industrial systems. Later on, Japan's economy surpassed what it was before and during the war. The education system also boasted a high literacy rate, and education standards topped those of other countries. However, the main difference in Japan's teaching style that was lacking in other education systems was the concepts of respect and responsibility. I will expand more with an insert of me and Professor Jacobson's conversation. At Harvard, he teaches Japanese linguistics. He has also lived a good amount of his life in Japan.
I was born there, and my parents were Christian missionaries there. And I went back and forth between the US. Actually, my dad was from Canada, but I lived probably, let's say, up through the age of 16. I spent 12 years in Japan.
Professor Jacobson also took grad school in Japan.
I would say I've had probably 6 or 7 year-long trips to Japan since then. So I probably spent a total, if you add it all up, of somewhere around 18 years altogether in Japan. In Japan, there is a great sense of responsibility, but it's probably a responsibility to the group, and the one's role in the group is more important traditionally in Japan than one's own characteristics. Competition is not so much on the individual level. Competition is between groups, and you are your behavior is very much what you consider to be the right or wrong way of acting will often have to do with whether what you do contributes to the group you're in or not. That's also tied into the idea of kind of dependency on the group for decisions which probably in other Western countries, at least, people make on their own. So, for example, traditionally people, when they got into a company, the idea would be they would be in the company their whole life. In the US, of course, people will often go from company to company many times in their lives. It's changing in Japan, but traditionally, we pretty much, once you're in that company, you expect to be with it for your whole life.
And with this ongoing sense of responsibility, Japan rose on its fresh economic power and began improving on healthcare. In a short span of time, Japan founded thousands of healthcare advancements and made healthcare affordable to everybody. Now that we have a basic understanding of where Japan is now and how it got to where it was, we can now dive into the diet of Japan and the lifestyle. I would like to begin with diet first. With the internet disposable at our hands, we are able to find limitlessly almost any information we want to know. And being curious about what causes the most deaths in humans, I decided to search that up. The first website that popped up, and the ones that followed them, continue to talk about ischemic heart disease and how it wins by a landslide for the #1 cause of death worldwide. Many nutritionists and food scientists have conducted experiments about whether certain foods or certain diets can produce longevity. And many of their studies have proved that diet does indeed affect certain factors that cause early death. And diet does seem to be one of the main reasons. In Japan, Japanese people are less likely to eat meats such as pork, steak, and chicken. Instead, they eat a surplus of fish, seafood, vegetables, and soybeans. They take a reduced amount of saturated fatty acids, which helps reduce the chance of developing ischemic heart disease. Choosing to not digest as much animal fat as many other countries have also helped them lower the rates of cardiovascular diseases, and overall is a great component of optimizing cholesterol. However, as the years pass by, studies have found that more and more younger generations are beginning to approach a more Western diet, especially in Okinawa, an island in Japan with the longest life expectancy. The traditional diet of Okinawa is root vegetables, such as green and yellow vegetables, especially in Okinawa, an island in Japan with the longest life expectancy. Some ideas to utilize diet as a way to achieve a longer lifespan are actually based on some genetics. Scientists are conducting genome-wide association studies to find which aging-related biological pathways relate most to how long someone will live. By doing so, they attempt to find solutions. Currently, scientists are still under the process of finding the solutions. Foods that often don't cause high blood pressure or cardiovascular disease are mostly vegetables and fruits, omega-3 rich fish, green tea for antioxidants, and way fewer refined carbohydrates and reduced meats, especially saturated fats. Alongside a low calorie and starch intake, salt is often less used here than in other countries, such as Canada or the US. However, an understandable starting point for achieving a longer life is the 80% method. Once you feel 80% full, you should stop eating, even if it means you are still just a tiny bit hungry. This method works really well if you want to limit yourself from overeating. However, there is one research paper that I've read that has a super simple way of summing up all of these dietary restrictions. It is an article published by Craig Wilcox, who currently works at the Okinawa Research Center for Longevity Science, and he says this: a low caloric intake, a high consumption of vegetables, a high consumption of legumes, moderate consumption of fish products, low consumption of meat products, low consumption of dairy products, low fat intake, emphasis on low GI carbohydrates, higher fiber intake, and a moderate alcohol consumption. An interesting takeaway that I have been able to receive from reading many research papers on the longevity of Japanese people is that the major staple food that actually has been studied to make a big difference in Okinawa is the sweet potato. It has a high content of fiber and is rich in non-artificial sugars, vitamin A and C, potassium, iron, and calcium. Now, after summing up the main points of why diet plays an important role in longevity, I will now switch gears to an interview that I conducted with Professor Jacobson. This interview will help give you some foundation to better understand Japan, and especially to better understand the concepts that will be talked later on and that relate to longevity. In the interview, we talk about concepts, education, communities, government, healthcare, and also work culture, which plays an important role that I will explain later on after the interview. I hope you enjoy this interview and that you can take something away from it. So the first question I have is, what are concepts taught to children at a young age during school?
Concepts. Well, that covers a large range. Japanese schools are very good at teaching, particularly concepts like math and writing and reading. They're probably stronger in the early years of elementary school. But it's a system that requires a lot of, well, I would say a lot of memorization. Japan is trying to get away from that, but probably less emphasis traditionally on creativity. And that is something that Japanese schools have been trying to address. But there is real emphasis when a child starts going to school, particularly at home. The child, there's a kind of a dependency syndrome that's talked about in Japan. Amae, it's called, a very high level of dependency on other people, particularly the mother. But then once they start going to school, they have to start learning how to show different degrees of distance to other people, like their teachers. So you don't act in a too familiar a way with your teacher. Rather, you treat the teacher with respect. So there are different forms in the language that are used for respect that a child will learn at that school age. Probably even in, probably from elementary school and then going on. Where you don't address your teacher by first name or things like that. Okay, so there are a lot of concepts of interpersonal relations and things like that, which are taught at a fairly early age in school. And once they start school, they learn pretty quickly. The Japanese, I don't know if you know anything about the language of Japanese, but there are 3 different alphabets that are used altogether. There's something called hiragana, something called katakana, and then also Chinese characters are used. So they have to begin learning these very, very quickly. And by the time they're graduated from high school, most of them will probably know, close to 1,000 or 1,500 Chinese characters in addition to the Japanese alphabets. So all this requires a lot of memorization. There's a lot of emphasis on memorization, which actually helps students do better on scores on tests and so forth in areas like mathematics. But as I said earlier, perhaps not so much in the area of creativity. So even in terms of getting into a university, a lot of emphasis is placed on an entrance exam of that university, rather than things like compositions, which in the US are very important. When you apply to a good university, you have to submit a composition, and that's looked at very carefully. That doesn't play quite the role that it does in.
Mind if I intervene? I was just wondering, I know entrance exams, especially in Asian culture, is like a huge part of one's life, especially like in China, there's Gaokao. In Japan, is the entrance exams like a big influence in how high schoolers treat their education?
Oh, very much so. That's right. Yeah. And a lot of parents, if they're worried that they're not going to get the training they need in the high school that they go to, let's say it's a public high school, they will send their children to what are called juku. These are cram schools, after-hour schools, weekends, where students are sort of taught directly the kinds of things, the strategies for taking tests and learning extra things that are not in school. Maybe not emphasized as much in school, or parents maybe don't feel that their children are getting the academic training in school that they need for getting to the college that they want. So yeah, every college typically has its own entrance exam, so that's very different from the United States. And that probably is the single most important factor in getting into a school, even more than things like recommendations and grades in high school. So that is a very influential transition in life when a Japanese student is graduates from high school and wants to get into college, and even if they want to go to a private high school, they might have to take an exam, at the end of junior high school, or even getting into junior high school. In some cases, you have to take exams. So if a student goes to a public school their whole life, they're probably not going to have to take an exam until they enter university. But students whose parents want them to get into private schools will have to take exams. So taking exams is a very big part of the educational culture in Japan, definitely.
In a classroom in Japan, is the teacher more focused on the whole group and teaching everybody, or are they individual focused?
Classes tend to be large, and there isn't a lot of sort of teaching tailored to individuals. But having said that, schools do have ways of providing special education for children. There's money spent on that, but traditionally education in Japan has been sort of one size fits all. Every school throughout the country has to follow a set curriculum that is set by the Ministry of Education, and that has pluses and minuses. It means that everybody is sort of expected to learn a minimal amount. So people that graduate from high school are equipped with the kind of skills traditionally in terms of reading, in terms of math and things like that, that most companies would want. But it's pretty much a one size fits all, at least when you compare it to the United States. Yeah, not a lot of individualized curriculum tailored to students with different learning styles.
Do teachers and in general, like the public, have a say in what the government does or what is given out in like mandates?
Yes, well, I mean, everybody votes, and there are also unions, teachers unions and things like that, which have a lot of power in terms of what they say to the government. But I mean, the whole system, as I said, there's this Ministry of Education that sets pretty much the basic curriculum for everybody from elementary school all the way through high school. And that means that no matter what part of the country you're in, you're pretty much going to get the same kind of education. So you don't have these differences like in the US, where school districts can be very, very different in terms of the quality of education, depending on the tax base of the district that school belongs to. So schools in the US are supported by property taxes. They're not supported by government taxes, for example. They're not supported by government funds that come from taxes. So, I mean, there's a plus and minus to that. So you asked whether there's, a lot of attention given to individual learning styles. I would say no, compared to the US. But the flip side of that is that everybody is pretty much given the same quality of education. Now, of course, there are going to be variations between good teachers and bad teachers, but still the curriculum that is followed is pretty much the same. So you can move around from one part of Japan to another part and adjust to the new school you go to without any problem, because pretty much students at your age level are going to be studying the same content that you were in the school district that you left. So there's a plus to that, but then there's a minus. I mentioned earlier on how, for example, there's not much emphasis on creativity, especially things like creative writing and so forth. It's very much based on a test-taking kind of culture, which is very heavily dependent on memorization.
Exams aren't only important in Japan. They are also very important in other Asian cultures, such as Chinese with the Gaokao, and also Korea. Many of these places in Asia focus a lot on memorizing and having very tough exams that determine the rest of your life. Adding on to the stress of exams, I would like to touch back on something I previously talked about with Professor Jacobson, which was responsibility to the work, or to your boss, or to the company. In fact, this responsibility causes a lot of the toxic work culture that a lot of the outsiders and foreigners see in Asian culture. If you could talk more about just what is work in Japan, what does it mean to every single individual?
Right. So this ties in with what I was just talking about. So, it's a sense of belonging that you have to the company means that you devote yourself fully to the company. And traditionally, you were expected to give priority to the company, especially for the breadwinners, which traditionally were men. Um, so, um, especially in areas like Tokyo, where the companies would be centered in the center of town, people would have to, but land is so expensive and houses are so expensive, people can't live close to their jobs. So many people have to commute long distances from areas kind of far away from Tokyo. But some of them, like 1 hour each way, maybe 2 hours round trip, or even more. So typically, men, even fathers of families, would be gone from the home early in the morning before everybody gets up, and won't get back at night until the children are asleep. Maybe won't see their children except on the weekends. But that's part of the expectation, that you are devoted fully to your company. And traditionally, there was a feeling of unease if other people were still working, and you wanted to leave, you wanted to go home, but you felt that by leaving early, you would be disloyal to your fellow workers. So there's pressure to stay together, and then even pressure to do things after work with the company. To go out drinking, for example, with your boss or colleagues. It'd be very hard to say no if your boss invited you to, even though you really needed to get home if you were a parent and spend time with your children. So for many years in Japan, that created kind of a system where the father was kind of absent. And women, on the other hand, are traditionally expected to raise children, and that has been a real problem for careers for women, because they need to be able to take time off from a company when they have children to devote to raising their children. And that's sort of almost expected in certain company cultures, so that the woman is not really given positions that would assume that the woman is going to be in the company their whole life, and therefore that cuts out a lot of opportunities that women might otherwise have. So you find a very low number of women in high-ranking positions in companies and things like that. Now that's changing. And the government was always saying we want to do more to open up opportunities for women, but there are some basic ways in which that culture still has not really changed. It's hard for women to get ahead because of these expectations.
And Professor Jacobson is correct. There is a little bit of sexism in the Asian work culture. And yes, they are making their way around it. They are finding solutions. But the problem that is arising from these solutions is that a lot of women are now taking a lot of their time to go to work. And with less people wanting to have children, here comes the dilemma of having a weird population pyramid where the big parts are in the older generations and the younger generations are lacking in amount of children.
Well, it clearly, I mean, this has become a disincentive for women to have children, because it is therefore going to cut them out of opportunities that they would otherwise have. I mean, if they want to have a career and have children both, traditionally they're going to be forced into a choice between the two, which many of them do not want to have, and therefore there's a disincentive to even marry. Not only not have children, but not even to marry, because it cuts off so many paths of self-fulfillment that women would otherwise want or have, and that has been changing in recent years. Women are wanting to have more say in society. There are more and more women politicians. There are more and more women professors nowadays. There are more in the corporate culture, but the corporate culture, I think, probably overall is a little bit behind in that sense, in terms of women having access to top management positions. But because of the fact that having children is going to mean, for the reasons I described earlier, not being able to get ahead in your career, this has been a disincentive to having children. not to mention just the huge expense of having children, of sending them away to college and things like that. Um, so yeah, the low birth rate is related to lower marriage rate. Many women don't want to get married, and there's also an effect on the male side, which some sociologists have looked at, which is that men are now, because of the economy, cut out from this culture. So not as many companies are able now to hire you and guarantee that you're going to have a job for life, which means that men are going to have to find other jobs. And the pipeline, especially for those who don't go to college, from high school, let's say you don't want to go to college, but you want to go directly into a job from high school. That used to be possible in Japan. And there were ways in which the high school would actually help you. The guidance counselors would actually have contacts with companies that traditionally would hire out of the high school. But those kinds of pipelines are decreasing. And that means for many men, particularly those that don't have high education, are going to be cut out from job security in the way that they used to have. And not having job security is going to mean that they become less attractive as mates, as marriage partners. And this also, is affecting the low marriage rate. So it works on both sides, both male and female.
Now, adding on to this population pyramid, Professor Jacobson and I continue to talk about another concept, which is foreigners. And I believe this is also very important to understanding why Japan has this population pyramid.
The culture is not really something that foreigners can understand, and that unspoken assumption has made it difficult even for the immigrants that come in to really rise to very important positions. So most of the immigrants that are there are in manual labor type work, nurses and things like that, and types of work like that. But the road to coming into Japan and then spending your whole life there with the possibility of moving ahead into a comfortable lifestyle with a good job is still a very difficult road for foreigners. And part of that is due to policy in Japan, just the fact that there aren't as many visas available to workers as really is necessary to fill out the workforce. And part of it is, I guess you would call it cultural. Japanese feel uneasy when they're around people that don't think or assume the same things, that don't think in the same way or have the same assumptions that they do. And that will often be the case with somebody who doesn't look Japanese, particularly if they can't speak the language. So these are all barriers to immigrants really becoming integrated into the society.
Yeah, I think that can also be seen in America, especially when people from Asia or Mexico come in as immigrants, and they're often shunned away because of the language boundary. They don't seem similar and they have different priorities.
And just as I had to talk about foreigners, I had to also talk about poverty, and especially people who can't afford the best education.
Do you think poverty affects the level of education people get throughout Japan?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because traditionally Japan has not viewed itself, at least most Japanese would not view, kind of a joke that it used to be that everybody in Japan would consider themselves middle class, but that picture is changing too because of the economy. So it used to be quite a few years ago, you would rarely see homeless people, for example, but now they're quite common in certain areas of certain cities, both in Tokyo and Osaka and some of these big cities. So obviously for those men that I just talked about, for example, who are not able to go on to good jobs, just graduating from high school, their income level is going to be lower. Whether they're actually below the poverty level would be another matter. The Japanese government does spend huge amounts on welfare, on keeping people giving them a welfare safety net. So you probably don't see the wide divisions of wealth that you do in countries like the United States, but it is increasing, that difference between those that have and those that don't.
Hmm. About welfare, how do you think the government treats the elderly?
Well, that's a huge part of it. That's right. So because the elderly population is increasing so much, and traditionally in Japan, the retirement age was, well, depending on what field you're in, it could be set at 65, but it was rarely over 70. So people would often have to retire, even when they didn't want to or didn't have to in terms of their physical health and their mental acuity. But they had to retire, and that means that there had to be some kind of system to support them after that. Many of them, of course, would have some kind of pension, from their company, but also the government plays a large part in supplying the income to elderly in Japan, and that amount that is having to go to supporting the elderly means that the government, debt is constantly increasing. Japan has the worst national debt, in the world in terms of debt, the ratio of debt to GDP. I forget the exact figure. You can look it up, but it's something like the national debt is like 20 to 30 years worth of GDP. It's really huge. They see their parents have with other people. So yes, gift giving is a big thing, and it does create an obligation in the person that receives the gift, unspoken, that the gift has to be returned in some way. So there are a lot of Japanese that find this very burdensome. They don't want to get caught up in this social trap of obligations to other people.
Mhm.
But traditionally it is there. That's right. So people you receive gifts from, you are sort of saddled with an obligation that you need to do something in return at some point.
Now, I was really glad I was able to meet with Professor Jacobson and talk more about my interests in longevity, but especially about Japan. See, the internet is very good in getting solid data information, but in other cases where I would like to have more personalized information, the internet isn't just the best source for me to use. I feel like talking with Professor Jacobson had widened my vision and understanding more about Japan, and because of so, I could better understand another concept which I learned about online, which was longevity. And through both mediums of information, I would like to talk about some cons of the Japanese workforce that might cause a high suicide death rate. Many adults have suffered tremendously from the toxic office culture in Japan. But this isn't solely focused on Japan, this is for all Asian countries as well. By 2019, Japan had the second highest suicide rate in the G7 developed nations. Even so, during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, Japanese suicide rates spiked by 34.7%. Like what I talked about with Professor Jacobson, there is often this feeling of a quote-unquote, I cannot be the first person to leave, and a responsibility to the company. Matter of fact, this harmful phrase can also be found in other East Asian countries too. After 1997, Japan's need to suddenly maximize industrial output had caused many workers to work from as early as 5 to as late as 10, 5 days a week. Currently, it has become a social pressure to stay in the office and not leave before the manager or the boss. And if you left, you would be unloyal to your company. Many holidays too have become a part of the stress and pressure. Many companies only allow their workers to have several days of vacation per year. Due to this constant pressure, many citizens stay single. As their time in the day dwindles to roughly a single hour of free time and the companies need arduous work, they lack the commitment to stay in relationships. Further so, raising a child would cause the dilemma of either not spending enough time with children or not doing work well enough. To stop such a certain feeling, most women and men stay single. If you look at the Japanese pyramid, what should be a normal population pyramid has transformed into a thicker middle, thinner base, meaning there are more and more adults and fewer children. Through my interview with Professor Jacobson, reading online, and also checking out articles published by scientific professors, I was able to gain a lot more information about why Japanese people live so long and more about longevity. However, even through all of this research, I had learned even more about Japan. I hope that through this episode, you're able to learn about why people live so long, but more about Japan. I would love to go more in depth in everything I talked about in this episode, but that will be saved for other episodes in my podcast. So, I hope you enjoyed this episode and the talk with Professor Jacobson, and I'm really hoping that you learned something from it. See you next time.